Yes.
I've a handful of questions. This morning, you were giving evidence about the. I suggested it was an impasse between the Department of Health and McFarlane Trust about funding in the early years before Archer, about 2008. When you were considering your options about trying to get more money out of the Department of Health at that stage, did you consider launching a media campaign, getting in touch with TV, documentary makers, or anything of that sort?
No, not that sort of thing. We took opportunities, as I said this morning, to write to the relevant politicians. But beyond that, we always took the view, given our slightly strange in-between position, that we were not a campaigning body, and that there were others who could and did campaign in those sorts of ways. But no, we did not campaign, in quotation marks.
When you made an appeal to find the lost widows,
yes,
in the newspaper, you said you didn't think you got much of a response from that.
Yeah.
What were your next steps? What was the strategy after that? Can you recall?
Well, as I implied, at least if not said, we relied on the networks provided by the communities of care in different parts. There were very often, as I recall, there were several sort of, I'm going to call them hotspots, but there were areas of localities where there were a number of particularly infected beneficiaries who had their own networks, and so word would get out through that means. Self-defeating, and it's not self-defeating. No, not. Our newsletters again were making our desire to find more of the beneficiary, or get more beneficiaries to come forward, went. But of course, that was going to existing beneficiaries, and you were relying upon them to communicate. And Haemophilia Society, as I say, were very, very good in that respect. And I suppose there was the partnership group, which we've touched on, I think, today. They had men-only events, some of which I attended. And I know, not that I attended, but I know there were female-only events of that kind. And I suppose I believe we were relying upon the disseminating opportunities that those events provided. But if somebody had decided, particularly among the earlier widows, that they just wished to move on and leave it all behind them, it would have been very difficult to get them to come forward, which is why we did we tried the national advertising route, and obviously the same applies to those who had passed beyond the support stage from the trust. Although you might have hoped that they would at least have remained sufficiently in touch to know what was going on. But no, we didn't have any big strategy after that national advertising. And I don't know, as I said to you earlier, I don't know to this day how many more widows. It was taking time for more widows to come forward, but I have no idea how many more came forward after my retirement, as it were.
We were discussing just before the break the issue of the equalisation payments between the McFarlane Trust and Eileen Trust. When you learnt of perhaps learnt for the first time of the Department of Health's response, which was no, we're not going to deal with this, can you recall whether or not you took any further action? For example, took legal advice, to see whether or not there might be something that this group could do?
No, I'm sure we didn't take legal advice, and I tell you the way I'm sure of that is that even though I wasn't able to point specifically to documentation when we were talking about this earlier, it was a well-known. I'm not going to say accepted, but it was the fact that that was the department's position, and that, you know, as they said, to use their word, in strict terms, the two communities were not alike, and therefore they said they could therefore argue that you know, there was no unfairness in the treatment. The fact that that was their position was very well known, and I can't remember now whether it came up in the Archer proceedings or not, but I'll be surprised if it didn't.
What level of reserves did the Charity Commission require or recommend that you maintain during your time as chair of the McFarlane Trust? I can't remember precisely. The Charity Commission had clear guidelines, so clear that I can't remember exactly what they were. It wouldn't have been. It would obviously vary depending upon the circumstances of each trust that they were, each charity they were concerned with, I guess. But there was a form of words which I know we've referred to, or in documents that we have referred to, which, as I recall, spoke in terms of, I'm not going to get this right, but certainly in terms of covering future, being satisfied you'd got enough reserves to cover your future commitment. In other words, it wasn't just, Charity Commission expected you to have something in reserve in order to provide for the future. And as I said earlier this morning, I think, certainly before we started to get the commitments, and long before Archer, we had no reason to believe that the department was committed to the future, and that was why we saw that it would be a grave risk and indeed a dereliction of our duty if we did not keep sufficient reserves to ensure that our beneficiaries were not just let to drop off the cliff. And so that was why we set upon, at least to be sure we had 1 year in reserve. And as I was saying earlier, I would have, had it ever happened, I would have expected that wouldn't all have been exhausted in 1 year. We'd have tried to find a way of a gradual reduction, but fortunately that never happened. What contact, if any, did you have with any of the devolved administrations, in particular the Scottish executive, during your time as chair?
None.
So all of your communication with government was through the Department of Health?
Yes. We had some. We were from time to time. I referred to the trustee Philip Dolan earlier, who was, if I can say, plugged in to Scotland and haemophilia in particular in Scotland, and I don't doubt that he was able to give us comparisons, shall we say, from time to time, or he would draw out particular lessons from what was happening in Scotland. He was particularly helpful to us at the time of the Penrose inquiry, and being able, we were kept abreast of what was going on there and how that was going. But we didn't have any direct communication with any of the devolved governments, no.
To what extent do you, or did you then, or do you now, consider the attitude of the Department of Health during your time as chair to have been that the McFarlane Trust had become an unwanted financial burden or a relic of actions or inactions of past governments?
I don't know that I could characterise it in that way. I'm sure they would have been very happy not to have had us on their backs, as it were. But in our meetings with them and other communications, thinking of telephone calls and others between Martin Harvey and the officials in the department, they always set out to appear understanding, there was no sense of them telling us to get lost or anything like that, but they did take a very unsatisfactory, presumably prompted by politicians with whom presumably they spoke, positions on what we wanted to do. No amount of, until after Archer, no amount of saying to them that, we should be able to do this. We're charged with relieving need and so on, and in order to be able to do that properly, we need more. It just was a blank wall.
By the time you were appointed chair of the McFarlane Trust in 2007, the Skipton Fund had been running alongside the McFarlane Trust for 3 years. How did the existence of the Skipton Fund impact upon the role and decision-making processes within the McFarlane Trust for the co-infected bleeding disorder patients and their families?
In truth, hardly at all. We were, as the McFarlane Trust was very aware and conscious of the Skipton Fund because we were providing the administration for it. But we had no impact on nor sought to have any impact on what the Skipton Fund was doing. They had their own trustees. We had ours. I can't remember. I don't believe that we had. I know we had a crossover, if that's the right word, with the Eileen Trust, and we had. I thought it was only one trustee that we appointed, but I think it was 3 out of 5, certainly at some stage. But I don't think we had anything like that with the Skipton Fund. So no, there was no interaction which caused the two trusts to take differing views or the same views or anything like that. There was nothing of that kind.
Or to say, well, let's not prioritise the co-infected because they're being looked after by Skipton, for example. No. We looked at our job. Was to look after our beneficiaries, and we took them, took them exactly as they were, as our beneficiaries. Yeah, our primary beneficiaries. So those were all the questions from the call participants.
Well, I just have a couple of questions. The first is this: you hadn't done any charitable work before you became a trustee and chair of the McFarlane Trust.
No.
And you told us why that was earlier on. When you finished your term of office, did you leave with a sense of achievement or disappointment, or was it a mixture?
Oh, a mixture, very much a mixture. I left, in terms of the reason and timing of my leaving, I felt that it was time that I did, and there should be another chairman. As it happened, and I'm sure you're going to be interviewing him, or he's going to appear before you, Roger Evans had been a trustee as well, but he was particularly involved with the development of 2 work streams, 2 working groups, the fruits of which were coming together at that time, and so it was eminently appropriate, I thought, for him to take matters on from there. That's to do both with dealing with the reserves and also with the new welfare policies. So that was the context in which I thought it was the right time for me to leave. As to whether, so in that sense I wasn't disappointed for that reason. I was disappointed as to the outcome where we'd got to. We'd made not so much through our efforts, but because of the influence of Archer and all that, things had changed very much to the better for our beneficiaries from the time that I had started. So that was rewarding, but at the same time it was very disappointing, because there was the government's, the politicians' chance to get it right at last, to put right what had not got, and they'd not got right all those years before, and they just didn't take it for an amount of money which, in the context of the Department of Health budgets, whether it was all one or there were two pots, as we were talking about earlier, I don't know, was insignificant in the context of the whole. And that was very disappointing. But nonetheless, I felt rewarded because I felt that the trustees, all of them over time, had all shown great commitment to try to do the right thing by everybody, recognising the difficulties they had in satisfying everybody because they knew they couldn't satisfy very many. No, so in that sense, mixed feelings, but there were satisfied, I think, that the job had been done by me and their fellow trustees as well as we could do over that period.
So far as your disappointment that the government hadn't responded more positively, as you saw it, to the Archer
more completely,
inquiry, it's probably obvious from your earlier answers, but perhaps you can spell it out for us. What would you rather they had done than what they did?
Oh, what we wanted them to do was to move the payments, the regular payments. It would have been excellent if they'd had another ex gratia payment to all of those who had originally been infected, directly or indirectly. But certainly that all payments to the primary beneficiaries, we should call them, should be on a non-discretionary basis. For all the reasons that you were addressing me on earlier as well. These people, all of these beneficiaries, hated the idea that they were relying on charity. They had no business relying on charity to help them through the difficulties that they were living with, living with and expecting to live with for a long period of time. There's long gone the days when government and others thought these unfortunates would all be dead within 5 years. And so, that it was... And for the fact that we were still left with a rump of the obligations to provide discretionary top-up payments and individual grants, nobody enjoyed doing that at all, least of all the people who had to make the applications. So that was the big disappointment. If we'd been left with providing what we could have hoped for, was being left with providing for and concentrating on the non-infected community, the widows and orphans and so on. And also, it would have been good, we would have hoped, I think, and I think our beneficiaries would have hoped, that we would have continued to provide, or be the source of the non-financial support that we were organising. People like Neil Bateman, for example, you're going to hear from, I gather. But providing a source for that sort of advice, and also a way of coordinating, if nothing else, some of the beneficiary activities and interrelationships and so on. All of that, there was clearly a good reason for a trust, if our trust, why not, to continue to exist. But there was never any need, and should never have been any need for it to be there to support the victims of this tragedy.
Yeah. The other thing which I wanted to ask you was simply this. You've spoken about the guidance from the Charity Commission being to keep a certain amount of money in reserve. Did the Trust do what many charities do and take advantage of those accounts which are accessed through being a charity for longer-term investment? Or where did you keep the reserves invested?
The reserves were invested in an investment portfolio which was managed by investment managers, the name of whom I'm not now going to remember.
So
I
this
honestly
was
don't...
a bespoke arrangement.
Bespoke arrangement, yes. I don't remember what you're referring to, whether it was available to us or not. I honestly don't know.
Thank you. I've no further questions.
Thank you.
Is there anything you would like to add to your evidence?
No, I think not least by dint of having that summary at the end, I've said, I think, all you want to hear from me.
Well, I have to say, I'm very grateful to you in a number of ways. You've given us a very clear and very helpful exposition of how the McFarlane Trust functioned, particularly between 2007 and 2012, your term of office, and explained why it took the various steps it did and what it thought and how it approached things from your end of the operation.
Thank you, yes.
And the clarity with which you've done that, the humanity, has been apparent, I think, to all. So can I just thank you for that? And can I thank you also for your patience in being kept waiting an hour before we started? You're coming away this afternoon rather later than you might have anticipated. It's been very good of you not to raise the dicky bird of a complaint about that.
Well, I would never want to do that. If I could just say that now that you've given me the opportunity and the lead-in with your remarks there, what I regret about today is that you didn't have the benefit of having Martin Harvey to give evidence, because he would have had instant recall of a lot of the detail you might have hoped that I would have had. But because he was, as I'm sure you will have heard from Peter Stevens and others, he was a very effective chief executive who worked tirelessly in the interests. Not that they always accepted that, but that was the way of our lives, tirelessly in the interests of our beneficiaries. So, a tribute to him, if I may.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Now, next week.
Next week, we will be back on the Tuesday, the 2nd of March at 10 o'clock to hear evidence from Jan Barlow.
And we'll be sitting next week, or all week, I think.
Tuesday to Friday.
Yes. So 10 o'clock for those who are watching remotely, 10 o'clock on Tuesday, and I look forward to hearing from the witnesses and in front of them then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.